that which lies beyond civilization. Weird.
The weird and the eerie. I found an ear.
You did? A human ear?
Yeah, I thought I should bring it to you.
Yes, that's a human ear, all right.
There are opportunities in life for gaining knowledge and experience.
Run, girl.
Sometimes it's necessary to take a risk. I got to thinking, I'll bet someone could learn a lot by getting into that woman's apartment. You know, sneak in, hide, and observe.
Sneak into her apartment?
Yeah.
Are you crazy? Jeffrey, she's possibly involved in murder. You want to see the building?
Yeah.
Come on, I'll show you.
5 minutes from now.
We are back. We are Lost Futures, a Mark Fisher podcast, and I'm Steve.
And I'm Marlo.
And today we are discussing David Lynch's film Blue Velvet from 1986.
Through a vaguely Jameson lens.
Right, we're going to be reading this alongside of a chapter from Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism by Frederick Jameson. Just a moment, he just recently passed.
Yeah, I
so-
guess this is our first Jameson-focused episode since he passed, so
R.I.P. He's
dicks out for Freddy, baby.
an illustrious career and yeah, one of the longest running, to my knowledge, Marxist cultural critics who specifically was interested in an orthodox approach to Marxism, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, he basically wrote much of Mark Fisher's career, is a thing to say, and I think in this chapter in particular, because this is chapter 9 of Postmodernism, and this is not the first time we have referenced chapter 9 of Postmodernism, because he discusses at length Philip K. Dick's time out of joint in this. Fisher himself quotes this chapter in The Weird and the Eerie in reference to Philip K. Dick. Fisher does not directly discuss Blue Velvet extensively in The Weird and the Eerie, but, you know, he discusses David Lynch. Frankly, I didn't look it up if he has a Blue Velvet thing that basically apes this chapter, but
He does not.
So he's only...
I looked for it.
Okay, he's only dipped his hand in this chapter 9 bucket once. We're getting 2 episodes out of this, and if Fisher writes something about the wild...
Something wild.
It's Something Wild, which is the other piece of fiction that... Well, yeah, the other film, fictional narrative piece that Jameson references in this, then I guess we'll do a 3rd episode on chapter 9. But this is a very bunch of Mark Fisher, like specific things Mark Fisher has talked about, he's putting all together here, so I think it really does highlight his influence on Fisher.
Yeah, nostalgia for the present. We've been talking about nostalgia for as long as this podcast has been going. It's in the first chapter of Ghosts of My Life. It's something that I think Fisher was haunted by or very interested in the ways in which nostalgia worked. And you can see that both in The Weird and the Eerie and in capitalist realism.
Mm-hmm.
And how nostalgia plays a part in maintaining the horizons of our political possibilities and also our fictional possibilities. And Jameson here, I think, is more interested in the way in which people historicize their own time through the fictional narratives that they write in the present.
Mm-hmm.
And so, chapter 9, therefore, is called Nostalgia for the Present. Before we get into that too much, though, if you haven't seen the movie Blue Velvet, it is One of my favorite David Lynch films, maybe my second after Mulholland Drive.
I have not seen Lost Highway recently enough to definitively say I think I might like Lost Highway a little better than this one, but it's a movie by David Lynch, and it's one that people always talk about, and it's a pretty darn good movie, and it's a little interesting in its own interesting ways. I do enjoy the movie. It's not my favorite movies generally, but I can sit down and watch it, certainly.
Okay, so what happens in Blue Velvet? 1986 neo-noir mystery thriller film starts out with a father watering the lawn, and there's white picket fences. There's also men on fire trucks going by the camera, staring directly at the camera and just waving slowly as they go by.
You get the feeling that What's-His-Face stole from this for Edward Scissorhands.
Tim Burton.
Yeah, Tim Burton.
Tim Burton.
There's a very Burton-y, like, overdoneness to the way this neighborhood is depicted.
Yeah. It also reminds me of The Truman Show. It seems like a simulated reality where people are just going along on loops. And I think the beginning and the end of the film both have the same fire truck going around and the same guys waving to show that nothing changes here. So father watering the grass, boom, has a heart attack. Son, played by Kyle MacLachlan, is like, oh my God, I gotta go home and help out with the shop in the small town of Lumberton, North Carolina.
Yeah, so his good son off to college comes home to help with it.
Kyle MacLachlan is walking around in the grass. Second time grass comes up and stumbles on an ear. Not just an ear.
We didn't really cover the first time grass comes up, so we should just say it's a very iconic scene. It's something that Jameson comments on. It's something that Zizek comments on. Again, this is the opening scene. Very whimsical music is playing as the father is watering the lawn, has a heart attack. The music continues to play, zooms in on the father lying in the grass, then kind of macroscopically zooms in on the grass and the dirt itself. You see bugs crawling around, and the music kind of gets distorted, and it gets this slight horror tonality as it transitions to the next scene.
But all of a sudden, father has a heart seizure, falls down to the grass, and then, instead of showing the family confused, calling for ambulance, whatever, Lynch does something typically Lynchian. The camera moves extremely close to the grass, even penetrates the grass, and we see what is the real of this idyllic green lawn.
So, for the second time, we are again dealing with this image of the ground as being the source for this hidden evil.
Yeah.
Which is
an ear, but not just any ear, a human ear.
A moldy, severed human ear that Kyle MacLachlan finds in the park in his hometown.
And he's like, I should bring this to the police chief.
I should absolutely pick this up, disturb the crime scene, put it in a dirty fucking paper bag I also found on the ground, and just bring it to the police because, you know, they're like a shop that you go to when you find moldy human ears on the ground. And this is agreed with by the lead detective. I mean, I guess just play the scene.
Yes?
Real mom.
My name is Jeffrey Beaumont. I live near you. I believe you know my father, Tom Beaumont, Beaumont's hardware store?
Sure I do. I understand he's in the hospital. How's he doing?
He's okay, I guess. I hope. They're doing tests, that's why I'm home from school. Anyway, I was at the hospital this morning, and coming home through the field behind our neighborhood, there behind Vista, I found an ear.
You did? A human ear?
Yeah, I thought I should bring it to you.
If that's right, let's take a look at it.
That is what you should do with those.
Yes, that's a human ear, all right.
Yeah. So anyway, brings the ear to the cops, then visits the detective that night to be like, hey, I'm a precocious young boy, and I'm just interested in how that crime solving is going. And the cop's like, yeah, I mean, we're working on it, kid. I will or will not let you know anything in the future because you're just some dude not actually involved in this case. So as he's walking out, the cop's daughter, Laura Dern, shows up and is like, oh, I'm also interested in this mystery, and I heard it has something to do with some lady. Kyle MacLachlan and Laura Dern decide to team up like a couple of kid detectives and solve this here mystery. And by they decide, I mean, Kyle MacLachlan kind of harasses Laura Dern into it for the rest of the movie and leads her on while also having sex with a rape victim. But, essentially, he finds the ear. This is his call to action. It leads to detective shit. Where we meet a cast of kooky characters, including a sadomasochism-obsessed, ostensible mob boss who does a nondescript gas as a drug.
Yeah.
And is named Frank.
Frank Booth, played by one of the most iconic performances by Dennis Hopper.
Yeah, I mean, it's an AFI's, 10 iconic villains of all time in film. I mean, it's a very... Beyond even those who are obsessed with David Lynch, it's a very
recognizable, really like a meme before memes.
I mean, before fucking Heath Ledger's Joker, it probably was that archetype of awesome movie villain played awesomely.
He has this iconic line here.
Now it's dark.
Let's fuck! I'll fuck anything that moves!
What a very silly man. That's basically what the fucking movie's about. Basically, what has happened is Dennis Hopper has kidnapped this lady's husband and child, holding them for ransom, and forcing this lady to essentially be his sex slave. This is what happens in Blue Velvet. I will throw a little content warning in the description, I suppose, but this is literally, if you know one thing about Blue Velvet, it's a rapey movie. Yeah, so he's essentially coercing this woman into these S&M roleplay sex acts, and eventually Kyle MacLachlan basically saves the day. The husband dies, but frees the kid, and then gets Laura Dern at the end while having a weird fucking relationship with the woman who's also being coerced into being a sex slave at the same time.
There's a lot of fun parts in the early scenes.
There's fun parts throughout this fucking movie
that you've glossed over. I'll say the decision for Sandy and Jeffrey. Kyle MacLachlan is Jeffrey Beaumont, and Laura Dern is Sandy Williams. And Sandy and Jeffrey go over to Dorothy's place after seeing her sing the song Blue Velvet and drinking Heineken because, oh God, it's very Twin Peaks in that Kyle MacLachlan is super fixated on the drink that he has at the time, and he's like, if you've seen Twin Peaks, you remember him being like, oh, this is the best coffee I've ever had in the best diner I've ever had. And in this movie, his coffee is just saying Heineken the whole time, where he's like, what kind do you drink? What kind of beer do you drink? And she's like, she's 19, which at the time it was legal for her to drink, but she's just of age, I think. And in North Carolina, this was a law in the 80s. I looked it up because I was like, is it legal for them to be in a bar? Yeah. And he's like, I only drink Heineken. And then after he meets Dennis Hopper's character, Frank, there's this really funny exchange. And it is kind of like a setup joke and then a payoff a couple scenes later, which keeps happening. But yeah, this...
What kind of beer do you like? Heineken? Fuck that shit! Pabst Blue Ribbon!
Delightful film.
But he dresses up as an exterminator, and he has one of those old-timey tin cans, which is, again, it reminds me of Naked Lunch, Cronenberg's Naked Lunch.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Where that's following around an exterminator. Here, he's dressed up as one because he just so happens to have overalls in his, I guess, as the small town shop owner, he might have. His dad might have one. He is, after all, filling the shoes of his father as the Oedipal figure. And he like lies to her, says that he's a bug man. Then he sees somebody else who comes in and he's just spraying the pesticide or whatever. And she's like, oh man, everyone's coming over to see me, blah, 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 blah. And he just steals her extra pair of keys, which are just laying there while she's distracted. Like, every line of dialogue is hilarious.
Right.
Just the idea that he's going to dress up as an exterminator to break into this woman's house is hilarious.
Yeah. I mean, he does a lot of tropey detective stuff in the movie, which...
Okay, so... Movie ends, saves the girl. There's a bunch of sex stuff. He gets captured by Frank Booth. He takes him around. They listen to Roy Orbison's Candy-Colored Clowns. They go and meet our friend of the show. What's his name?
Dean Stockwell.
Dean Stockwell, dressed as a sort of clownish, effeminate character.
Yeah, presumably someone on the chain of drug distribution in this town, which is, I guess, what this organized crime outfit is doing, in addition to weird sex stuff, hijinks.
Yeah, there's like a mystery. He takes some photos, he stakes out the place, and then the cops raid Frank's place, and he ends up with the girl.
Well, with Laura Dern.
With Laura Dern.
And the other woman is left to bury her husband and raise her son.
Yeah, and Laura Dern's like, you cheated on me. And he's like, I'm sorry. And she's like, okay, I forgive you. 30 seconds later.
It's a very... Kyle MacLachlan's character is actually a terrible person throughout this entire movie.
Yeah.
I've been referring to what I think of him, but I haven't just said it. It's like just an awful person who like shows up at Laura Dern's high school and is like, get in the car, bitch, like in front of her boyfriend, and then she does, and then all the while is having sex with another woman who, again, I want to say is ethically someone who you might want to not have sex with if you're concerned about certain issues of consent and trauma and just a bunch of reasons.
Oh, and also there's a lot of S&M scenes, and that's...
mostly, she's like not in a stable place, dude. Kind of seemingly does a bunch of shit to play out some archetypal hero fantasy that he's just decided to take on himself.
Yeah, and in other films like this, he would be viewed as like the anti-hero, but in this he plays it straight, and that's like, he's like an anti-hero, but there's no signifiers that you normally associate with anti-hero.
I mean, other films probably would even be played more straight. I mean, you know, it is a bit of a classical male hero archetype, whatever the fuck you want to call it. It's just all very laid bare what's going on, just with the rawness of everything going on in the movie and the ability to think about it for 5 seconds. What
it reminds me of is, you know those clips of Ross without the laugh track?
Yeah, no, I could see that.
There was like a YouTube clip thing where they took the laugh track out of the Friends character, Ross. Mm-hmm. And Ross is just the most terrible person ever, but he gets away with it in the context of the show because there's a laugh track laughing.
Quick Mark Fisher quiz. What the fuck's that called again? Interpassivity.
There
we go, baby.
Where it's laughing for you so you don't have to laugh.
Yeah.
And on that point, my experience with this film, my recent experience with this film, was going to Film Forum in New York City and sitting down with a group of diehard David Lynch fans, I assume, because they're spending, maybe $20 for a ticket to go see a movie from 1986 in the theater. I think it was reconstructed to be like the original film type. And sitting in the theater, and every line of dialogue, even the most horrendous things are happening on screen, and there's a line of dialogue, the entire place was in stitches. There were people laughing, and then I was laughing because other people were laughing, and it was funny that they were laughing at the thing I had never thought was funny before. And I was like, oh, that is kind of funny. And now that I watched the movie, I just watched the movie again, it's also funny. And that was like a live interpassive experience of having a laugh track there. Mm-hmm. When the things I thought weren't funny were recontextualized with that kind of laugh track behind it. I mean, not a laugh track. It was literally people laughing at it.
Yeah, live studio audience. But Frank just says hilarious goddamn shit in the movie. Like, Frank just has funny lines, and we're laughing with Frank. Kyle MacLachlan, we're laughing at him most of the time because he is just a stupid dumbass who just kind of fails upward the entire movie.
But Kyle MacLachlan, the thing that they were laughing at the most was him just lying to Sandy, Laura Dern, and being like, there's things I can't tell you over the phone about my experience last night. And then he goes on and just tells her, I think she's in a bad place. She's got stuff about Frank. And then people are like, ha 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 ha. Like, it was really jarring. Yeah. The amount to which they found every line Kyle MacLachlan said
I think
funny.
The part where you think she's in a bad place is when you saw her getting raped and then you had sex with her immediately afterwards. This might be a sign she's in a bad place, Kyle MacLachlan. You terrible fucking person.
Yeah, and that was what was so jarring, that everyone was laughing at him being a terrible person.
Yeah. It's your classic case where it's like, Frank's nihilistically evil and just doesn't give a shit. Kyle MacLachlan is a fucking emotional vampire who has to cast himself as the hero in every situation, no matter who he uses or who gets hurt in the process.
Alright, this is one of the funniest scenes.
Why are there people like Frank?
Right.
Why is there so much trouble in this world?
I had a dream. In fact, it was the night I met you. In the dream, there was our world, and the world was dark because there weren't any robins, and the robins represented love. And for the longest time, there was just this darkness, and all of a sudden, thousands of robins were set free, and they flew down and brought this blinding light of love. And it seemed like that love would be the only thing that would make any difference. And it did. So I guess it means there is trouble till the robins come.
You're a neat girl.
So are you.
That joke also comes around by the end of it because in one of the last scenes of the movie, there's a very animatronic. Is it animatronic or it's like paper mache, like stop motion Robin that's outside the window.
Right.
And it's the fakest looking Robin.
Yeah.
Again, people were in stitches in the theater.
Yeah.
All right, so what does Frederick Jameson say about this film and nostalgia for the present? Nostalgia for the present, he links with Philip K. Dick's Time Out of Joint, and the way he defines nostalgia for the present is in relating the 1950s, the realities of the 1950s. Quote, "This is clearly," here he's talking about the post-war era, "this is clearly, however, to shift from the realities of the 1950s to the representation of that rather different thing, the quote-unquote 50s, a shift which obligates us, in addition, to underscore the cultural sources of all the attributes with which we have endowed the period, many of which seem very precisely to derive from its own television programs. In other words, its own representation of itself."
So I believe throughout this chapter, Jameson is playing with this idea and using Time Out of Joint, which we've discussed before, as a starting point of exploring this idea that in Time Out of Joint, there was a representation of the 50s that in a book written in the 1950s from the perspective of a fictional society in the 90s, looking back on the 50s. And so this fictional look back, nostalgic view of the 50s represented in a book actually written in the 50s seemingly lines up well with what our actual view of the 1950s was in this case 80s, but also 90s incidentally. And Frederick Jameson is exploring how this came to be. The starting point is, of course, that what we look at as the 1950s is also the way that people in the 1950s represented themselves, which is the, Leave It to Beaver television program, even, early 60s stuff like the Brady Bunch, and things like that. So we're basically looking for our source material in nostalgia at the same time, at the same thing that someone in the 1950s, at least living as a white upper middle class American, would cite as a representation of their own time. So he kind of starts at that point and then delves into this question of, well, what are these attributes and what does it mean when we look at something like Blue Velvet, which is a 1980s depiction of the 1980s that is also depicting this idyllic society, albeit now in our time for the purpose of tearing it down, but it's also presenting this idyllic society that is curiously using much of the same language as your Leave It to Beaver's view of the 1950s.
Yeah, there's a lot of nostalgic attributes to the way the 1980s is presented about the 1980s. Mm-hmm. And that is interesting. Like that the 1980s doesn't have its own historical character that it can attach to. It has to characterize itself as already an idealized version of the 1950s that's transplanted into the 1980s. So I think nostalgia of the present, there's no character of 1980s-ness. Like this movie could have taken place at any time after the 1950s, and because of that, like you could watch that movie, and I think this is one of the strengths of the movies and its continuing relevance and why people still like it, is because it has this sort of timeless quality to it, and that timelessness only could have been made in the 1980s, or that timeless quality could only be captured in the 1980s while signaling to the 1950s.
Right. I think that Jameson might suggest that it might be even equally arbitrary for the 50s to depict itself in that way.
Yeah.
That these are signifiers, essentially floating signifiers, that they're just this language that exists independent of the time. And, he kind of takes two sides of that. This is a speculation which presupposes the possibility that at an outer limit, the sense of people have of themselves in their own moment of history may ultimately have nothing whatsoever to do with this reality. That the existential may be absolutely distinct as some ultimate false consciousness from the structural and social significance of a collective phenomenon. Surely the possibility rendered more plausible by the fact of global imperialism, in terms which the meaning of a given nation state for everyone else on the globe may be wildly at odds from their own inner experience and their own interior daily life. Eisenhower wore a well-known smile for us, but an equally well-known scowl for foreigners beyond their borders, as state portraits in any U.S. consulate during those years dramatically attested. So, on the one hand, he's saying, these are signifiers that are built for a purpose of aggrandizement of the in-group by the in-group. Then he's also suggesting even further. There's an even more radical possibility, namely that the period of concepts finally correspond to no realities whatsoever, and that whether they are formulated in terms of generational logic or by the names of reigning monarchs or according to some other category or typologically classificatory system, the collective reality of the multitudinous lives encompassed by such terms is non-thinkable, non-totalizable, to use the current expression, and can never be described, characterized, labeled, or conceptualized. And that's your even more postmodern understanding that perhaps it's not tethered to anything. It's not even tethered to some Marxian notion of false consciousness or ideology in that sense. So I would even suggest that by the 1980s it was hard to imagine your time except referentially. He's even suggesting that, the 50s own references were also just empty references.
Empty references, and really just, I think Derrida uses the word trace. Like that it's traced from somewhere else, that itself is looking back to the 1930s, 1920s, that it always does seem to be a ruling class ideology that is just transmuted back to its people who then attach signifiers arbitrarily, right?
Yeah.
And we have that today. That hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
The tracksuits and synth music comes on and you can go, oh, that reminds me of the 1980s.
I think it's almost strikingly interesting how people our age discuss their childhoods, tracking the language that their parents used in discussing their own childhoods, and in a way that's strange to me because they're acting like, oh yeah, we just didn't have video games and played outside when we were kids, and it's like, we were the generation with the video games.
Yeah.
But they're almost like, I mean, there is a degree of re-enchanting like the video games from when we were kids or whatever the fuck. I mean, of course people do that too, but there seems to almost be this just picking the language straight up without reference to the quirks of your own childhood, of just these empty signifiers of like this community togetherness that was strikingly not around in the suburbs of the 1990s. It was not. Like, I was there. Yeah, so I think that's interesting that, even when you hear people in their 30s discussing the 1990s, it sounds like
the 1950s.
Right.
Or at least the way our grandparents discussed the 1950s.
Yeah, or my parents in the early 60s, I mean. But yeah, I mean, just this... Everyone's just going to continuously claim that they played outside more than kids play outside today, despite it being like...
Or that it was somehow better then than it was now.
Right,
and we can look at it as better then than it was now because of X, Y, and Z. Going outside being one of them, things being cheaper being another thing.
I mean, I've heard people in their 30s talk about participation trophies that kids today get, whereas they had to earn their trophies, and it's like, no, that was us. That was literally, that phrase participation trophy was invented in the 90s. Like, that kind of stuff always, like, kind of shocks me, where it's like, were you not around for that?
Yeah, it's like there's an inception.
Yeah, or a Mandela effect, or whatever the fuck you want to say, but...
Yeah, in David Lynch's terms, you have an idea,
Yeah.
and it was put into your brain. As a child, you had a much better life than you do now, because now you have to deal with bills and 40 hours a week of work.
And yeah, the decisions you make, like, have consequences that you might not be able to fix if they're really bad decisions.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's get back to our S&M fucking movie.
Yeah. He notes here that there's these two movies, Something Wild and Blue Velvet, which both have signifiers that people often associate with the 1950s. The like the slicked back hair with grease in it, and like the, I guess, tattoos with the heart with the arrow going through it. The bad guy, Ray, in Something Wild appears like some like pony boy out of The Outsiders from the trailer that I watched, and I think he's identified, and he's the rapist in Something Wild, and you know, is this archetypical pure evil that the movie identifies with the 50s. Like that this old system is the system that created rape culture that is then the antagonist in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
In a similar way, I think he identifies Frank Booth as a similar type of antagonist that is pure evil, a rapist who is holding Dorothy Valens, Isabella Rossellini as a sex slave against her will, or in her apartment to his purposes whenever he wants and calls on her. And he's also this archetypical evil character that has no morality, amorality, and that both of these characters signal, in this instance, like a organized crime, which I think he identifies also with the past.
Yeah, I mean, to the point that Frank is this almost archetypal. I mean, I think Judge Holden from Blood Meridian is another classic example. Also, Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men. Like, there's sort of a character that almost defies logic of how this could be a functioning person in society, other than they seem to walk with almost godlike powers outside of society because they are a literal demon incarnate kind of thing. I mean, one of my favorite little, like, just observations about Blue Velvet that I think Jameson reflects here is just, it gets to the point where you have to wonder how this criminal outfit is actually making money, because they are spending an inordinate amount of time and resources just chasing down Dennis Hopper's particular fetishes. Well, this is sort of the transgressiveness that it's discussing. So in Blue Velvet, however, it is explicitly related to drugs and therefore to crime. Although not exactly organized crime, rather to a collectivity of misfits and oddballs, and I think that is just the best way to describe the Frank Booth. Yeah, the Frank Booth crime family. They are just a bunch of
ragtag
weirdos who seem to joyride throughout town, stand guard while Frank rapes his sex slave, and I don't know, maybe sell drugs for money at some point, but we don't see that much.
Yeah, he has, I think, Raymond, Paul, and Hunter, who have all been in other Lynch movies. Jack Nance plays Paul, and he was in Eraserhead. And I believe Brad Dourif was in a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, he one of the Twin Peaks guys is in it. And there's another guy that just has a snake.
Yeah, and this is just, I feel like, kind of highlighting what you were saying earlier about this Frank as an archetype of evil. What Blue Velvet gives us to understand about the 60s in contrast is that despite the grotesque and horrendous tableau of maimed bodies, this kind of evil is more distasteful than it is fearful, more disgusting than threatening. Here evil has finally become an image, and the simulated replay of the 50s has generalized itself into a whole simulacrum in its own right. It's very much plugging in this almost disconnected role of evil.
Yeah.
That you're not even afraid of, you just think it's gross and dirty, and I think a lot of this movie just feels gross and dirty.
Yeah, in Something Wild, he also talks about about this construction of the idea of evil, and that Frank Booth of Blue Velvet and Ray of Something Wild don't scare anybody any longer, nor ought we really to require our flesh to creep before reaching a sober and political decision as to the people and forces who are collectively evil in our contemporary world. And then he goes on to say that Frank and Ray are representations of someone playing at being evil.
Mm-hmm.
That he's kind of and that there's nothing authentic about these people.
Right, and I think that just kind of goes to this, again, question of this, what is nostalgia for the present? It's these floating signifiers that we use to order whatever time period we're in, that it might sound like the 50s, but that's only because we all know the Leave It to Beaver and, Andy Griffith theme in our heads, but it's really how every time period describes itself, seemingly.
Yeah, towards the end of the chapter, he even discusses Marx with this, and said from the 18th of Vermeer, even that enabling costume party self-deception of which Marx spoke, the wearing of the costumes of the great moments of the past, is no longer on the cards in an ahistorical period of history. The generational combinature thus seems to have broken down at the moment it confronted serious historicity, and the rather different self-concept of postmodernism has taken its place.
Yeah, so, I guess, Mulholland Drive connections. We are, once again, featuring a Roy Orbison song. David Lynch apparently likes to do that.
Yeah, a very nostalgic sound.
Roy Orbison singing for the lonely, in the words of Bruce Springsteen. To the listener, that would just sound like a Roy Orbison song. But rest assured, Dean Stockwell was lip-syncing it in lipstick.
Yeah, and in that scene, it's interesting because Frank, played by Dennis Hopper, gets triggered midway through that song, even though he's the one that demanded Dean Stockwell ask him to do it. And he just flips the shit and stops the song immediately when he gets that trigger.
Yeah, and Dean Stockwell seems like he kind of expects this behavior from Frank as well. Dean Stockwell, the entire time, is someone who seems very willing and able to placate all of Frank's bullshit. Which, again, I think gets to Jameson's assessment where you're almost not even afraid of Frank, you just find him to be a disgusting asshole most of the time, or at the very least weird and laughable.
He's menacing, I would say.
Yeah.
He shouts every one of his lines.
Yeah, he shouts every one of his lines, but it's kind of, yeah, it's like a slightly unhinged shouting where you're just like, all right, man.
Yeah, like a yapping dog.
Right. I guess generally, the question of what is nostalgia for the present, I think, and going with the thesis of postmodernism itself is, it's this notion that in the modernist era, you had recalling of the past of, Greece and Rome, or Napoleon III dressing himself in the cloth of Napoleon I, and so forth. And Jameson is identifying this sort of postmodern mode of these empty signifiers that we just kind of attach to things without actually believing in it or having a historicity to base it in.
Yeah.
And that is, in essence, what he's identifying as nostalgia of the present, at least what I've gotten from this conversation and reading and whatnot.
The way I've described it is that it's a production of nostalgia, like an arbitrary production of nostalgia for the purposes of the present, which gets into more Fisher's themes, like it's a return to a time when we could think of things in time when there's a future ahead of us.
I agree in the sense of production because it is so arbitrary and not really attached to a time. I would say that even per Jameson, I would say that he's identifying a sort of a postmodern mode appearing even in the 1950s, where they start in this kind of Cold War mindset of, looking not to the past anymore, but just to this ahistorical moment that they're in, that they're constructing these new signifiers of themselves for the world, and that we've kind of been chasing that and doing that ever since.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I agree with the production. I just feel like it's almost, he's saying it's not even attached to a time in many ways, but it's just these invented signifiers that feel timey to us.
Yeah, and I think that feeling timey is grounded in the material conditions where you can imagine a future arising out of this time. Like, and that I think is why people, for instance, have this nostalgia for the 1920s, 50s, and 80s are all times that Americans sort of associate with a middle class to bourgeois characteristic where like the economy is booming, production is boosting morale, and we can feel good about the project of American exceptionalism as a force for good, and also like a time in which we can indulge and imagine a better future for ourselves. And the way I conceive, or at least the way I think of nostalgia for the present, is that we have a nostalgia for a time in which we could have thought of our present time having a future, but we don't.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this return to a time in which we can look forward.
Okay.
Which I think is a little maybe more hauntological than
I feel like in this case he's almost saying it's not even about, I mean, sure, you can imagine a future, but it's more about just looking at your present as this idealized space that is heightened in its own right in many ways.
Enchanted.
Yeah, and it's kind of that idea, and that we seemingly keep going back to these odd archetypes that at least superficially seem 50s-y to us, but he doesn't even think they're necessarily all that 50s-y. He thinks they're more just this invented idyllicness.
The other thing I wanted to point out, going back to that scene that we were just listening to, Roy Orbison and the Club Silencio, is this, he just loves lip sync.
Yeah.
He loves lip sync. He loves women lip syncing songs. In Inland Empire, at the end of Inland Empire, there's the Greek chorus of prostitutes who are lip syncing Nina Simone.
Mm-hmm.
In Mulholland Drive, we get the
Club Silencio
lip syncing of Roy Orbison, and here we get Dean Stockwell, not a woman, but a very effeminate.
He's effeminately presented.
Once again, like at a titular scene, and for no fucking reason. There's no logic to why.
There's no logic to anything any of the criminals in this movie do.
They just are. It reminds me of, once again, to the Naked Lunch scene. We're gonna shoot an apple off the head, right? The Willem Tell overture, with the presumption that they've done this a million times before.
Mm-hmm.
And here again, it's like Dean Stockwell knows what Frank wants him to do, and he's done it a million times before. It's similar to the rape scene where it's already assumed sort of that she knows what Frank Booth wants when he comes over, and they've done it a million times before.
No, there is a lot of space for an enterprising criminal in the Lumberton crime syndicate to murder Frank Booth and make organized crime a million times more efficient by just cutting out the weird shit.
Yeah, but also Frank Booth seems to be the one that's holding it together. That's the other thing, is he wears the most hilarious disguise.
Oh, God, yeah.
We didn't mention the disguise.
Yeah, no.
Talk about someone who's costuming like their own false projection of themselves. He wears the most hilarious handlebar mustache, which Kyle MacLachlan calls the well-dressed man.
Which, in the picture, he's dressed exactly the same as everyone else. He's wearing the same shirt, tie, jacket, pants that basically everyone in this fucking movie is wearing.
Again, going back to...
It's not like wearing a tux or anything.
Watching the movie with this group of people, he stakes out the place, takes a bunch of pictures. Every time that Ed Hopper comes out in this stupid costume that he's wearing, everybody in the audience was laughing. And then
it looks like a fucking makeup job for Anchorman is what it looks like.
And then he takes the pictures again to
Jim Gardner in the 70s.
Again to the cops place. He goes to Sandy's father and is like, I took these pictures. I don't know who he is, but I'm calling him the well-dressed man. And then it's just hilariously Ed Hopper with a mustache and a cowboy hat.
Yeah, he looks like one of the dudes who showed up in the fucking brawl scene in Anchorman. Is what it looks like. Yeah, fun movie.
That's Blue Velvet. Join us. This will be the last Patreon episode before we take a couple weeks break, and we'll come back at you with some extra eerie material.
Yep.
All right.
Let's hit the fucking road. We're giving our neighbor a joyride. Let's get on with it.